And today, I have the pleasure of announcing Amalia. So Amalia is a retired professor from the University of Maryland. As the University of Chicago webpage states, their research focuses on two areas: South Asian languages and writing system. That's what the webpage said. That's not all. If you really want to know who Amalia is, just read the titles of some chapters of her book, The Writing Revolution. Cuneiform, Forgotten Legacy of a Forgotten People. Egyptian hieroglyphs and the quest for eternity. Chinese, a love of paperwork. So much for Chinese. Linear B, the clerks of Agamemnon. Japanese, 3 scripts are better than 1. Cherokee, Sequoia, reverse engineering. The Semitic alphabet from Egypt to Manchuria in 3,400 years. King Sejon's one-man renaissance. So I really love that. Hangul is a one-man renaissance. Greek serendipity. The age of Latin and the alphabet meets the machine. And the opening line of the book blows Proust's Longtemps je me suis couché de bonheur and the fields call me Ishmael out of the water. This sentence is a time machine. So besides being one of the foremost experts in graphic linguistics, Amalia is one of the most wonderful human beings I know, always ready to share her knowledge and passion with us all, and to make the study of writing a pleasure like nothing else. So I'm very honored that you have agreed to be our keynote. Amalia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Wow. So before I begin, I'd like to just say how happy I am to be here. And also, I want to thank Yannis and Jerry and Irmi and Victoria and everyone else who worked behind the scenes to make this conference a great success. And why is clicking? There.
Yeah. Okay, let me get this out of the way. You should be good just with this.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
So also before I begin, I want to say something about this term philography, because it might be new to you. It's formed in analogy with philosophy, the love of wisdom, philology, the love of words. And so we have philography, the love, or by extension, the study of writing. And I hope this is something that we can all see ourselves in. So we are all, in fact, philographers. Now, to get started, I want to tell you a little story. About 10 years ago, I was giving a talk on phonemic-based writing systems in a linguistics department which shall remain nameless. But as soon as I got to the end of the talk, the chair of the department raised his hand and he said, "Why is this interesting?" I mean, when I study syntax, I'm studying the makeup of the human mind. But you're just butterfly collection. It's not interesting. And so I stood there somewhat paralyzed because, for one thing, I was laboring under a constraint that he was not, which was that you should be polite. And the other was that I was standing there thinking, okay, well, there goes the architecture department and the engineering departments. And if the only valid study is something that's the product, the instinctive product of the human mind instead of an invention, well, what do you have left? So I don't think I have to tell this audience why the study of writing is interesting, but I do want to pick up a little bit on some things that that syntactician said. So not why is this interesting, but why is this important? Why is the study of writing important? And also he mentioned what it is to be a human. So what actually does make us human? I want to follow up both of these questions. And when I say what makes us human, I mean, one thing is what makes humans special. There have been many other Homo species, and there are many other hominid species on Earth still today, but all other Homo species are extinct, and all other hominidae species are endangered and mostly critically so. So what is different about humans? Now, the linguists, including that syntactician, have an answer for this. And that is that it's language. Language makes us human. And Chomsky has said it in various ways, for example, where the ability to use linguistic signs to express freely formed thoughts marks the true distinction between man and animal or machine. That was before Chat GPT. But so there's one answer, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but there's actually another answer that I'd like us to look at. And if you look at what the evolutionary anthropologists say, they say that it has something to do with the way we transmit culture. Human cultural transmission is characterized by a so-called ratchet effect, in which modifications and improvements stay in the population fairly readily with relatively little loss or backward slippage. For those who may not know the term ratchet in English, it's one of these things. So you turn it one way and it doesn't turn back the other way. So when we say there's a cultural ratchet, it means that when advances are made, they tend not to get lost. And so there have, not only do we observe this in history, but there have been experiments done where human children behave very differently than apes. So they will, for example, focus on action as well as outcome. So if you show a child a wheel, they'll think, oh, a wheel, a very useful invention. How did that person make that wheel? Whereas the ape will just look at the wheel. Children are explicitly taught and engage in intentional learning. Children engage in social imitation. So if a wheel is what everybody has this spring, then they want a wheel too. And also they make normative judgments. So if my wheel has 6 spokes and your wheel has 4 spokes, if everyone else's wheel also have 4 spokes, then children will assume that my 6-spoke wheel is wrong somehow. Now, this cultural ratchet has allowed remarkable advances in culture and technology over the centuries and millennia. So what does this have to do with writing? Well, writing is a product of the cultural ratchet. So if we look at how writing is passed down, we see procedural imitation, pedagogy, social imitation, and we certainly see normativity. But writing is not only a product of the cultural ratchet, it also allows learning, cultural learning across space and time. So it amplifies the cultural ratchet out of all bounds. So writing becomes a bigger ratchet, what I call the great cultural super ratchet. So just to take one example of just what you can do with this great cultural super ratchet, Chinese records have been mined for references to eclipses. So the oldest reference to an eclipse in the Oracle Bone inscription dates from about 1300 BCE. And that inscription, which tells you that 3 flames ate the sun and the stars were seen, can be used in modern times, 3,300 years later, to calculate the viscosity of the Earth's mantle. How does that work? Just briefly, if you know the location of the eclipse, You can calculate the differences in rotation rate between now and then. You can then estimate the shape of the Earth, which tells you something about the amount of glacial rebound you've had since then, and you get the viscosity of the mantle. So there is a tremendous chain of information and inference that is made possible by written inscriptions. And this is just one extreme example of it. We have just a plethora of ways of getting information from people who aren't there. So the child making the wheel that I used as an example before is learning for someone who's there. But we now get all kinds of information from people who are not there. You and I can read the works, say, of Einstein or Newton. So this brings us to another question, or suggests the answer to another question, which isn't just what makes us human and outcompeting other hominids, but what makes Homo sapiens the dominant force shaping the planet today? And there are a lot of possible examples that you can use to make this point that we are the dominant force shaping the planet. But just as one example, 1 out of every 2 nitrogen molecules used by land plants comes from human activity. And similarly, we can say what has made the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration is a period of unprecedented cultural advances, coupled with unprecedented use of resources, and also human influence on the Earth system that started in about 1950. And this is a candidate start date for the Anthropocene, which is a geological period where the human footprint is a characteristic. So here are a bunch of graphs that show the vertical line in each case is 1950. And so this just shows you what we mean by the Great Acceleration. There's been an unprecedented explosion in population, in productivity, in prosperity. So we have population, GDP, foreign investment, transportation, telecommunication, tourism, conferences like this one. But it also comes with a tremendous use of resources. So water use, primary energy use, and everything. Everything, all these things have skyrocketed since about 1950. And the effects on the Earth system, this is not a neuroscience talk, much as I may be tending in that direction here. But the impacts on the Earth system have come at the same rate. So again, we have the lines at 1950. And we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, nitrous oxide, methane, and so other effects on the Earth system. But here's where it ties in, because here's a chart showing the global literacy rate. And I will mark for you there 1950. So corresponding to this tremendous explosion of prosperity and also resource use is an uptick in the number of people, the percentage of people using writing. And it also goes along with a huge explosion in the amount of writing those people are doing. So on some mid-afternoon of a February day recently, Worldometer told me that 200 billion emails had been sent so far, and it was only mid-afternoon. 8 million blog posts, 650 million tweets, and 8 billion Google searches done in less than 1 day. So more and more humans are using writing, and humans are using more and more writing. Now, correlation is not causation. I know that statistically, but I would challenge any of you to come up with a way that we could have done this without this. And nowadays we have audio visual, but how did we even get to that point? We did it by getting information from people who aren't there. So the Great Acceleration, we can claim, comes about very directly from the use of writing. Writing has been with us for thousands of years, but only since about 1950 has it become a common phenomenon that everyday people use it. Now, it comes with the Great Acceleration that's part of has come with some downsides. So most of the productivity gained, most of the benefits, and most of the overuse of resources are happening in the developed world. And as the authors of those charts that I showed you say, this points to the profound scale of global inequity, which distorts the benefits of the Great Acceleration and confounds efforts to deal with its impacts on the Earth system. Again, this is not a talk on earth science, but I've highlighted the reference to inequality there in blue, because while I don't necessarily have solutions to the inequality that writing has been part of, but I want to just flag it as we go so that we can be thinking about this. So just to sum up this particular part, writing is the great cultural super ratchet. It derives from and magnifies at a tremendous scale the human cultural ratchet. And it has allowed humans to become the dominant force on this planet. And it is subject to and exacerbates inequality. And so, yes, this is important. It is worth understanding it better. So in light of that, how do we understand it better? I'm going to present 5 things that I have learned over the past 20 or so years about writing, about this cultural super ratchet. So the first thing I've learned is what writing is, going all the way down to basics here. My definition of writing at this point is that it is a culturally mediated modality of language that operates by arranging conventional static symbols in space rather than in time. And so that implies that writing is actually a modality of language. This is not what I was trained to believe. I was trained that writing is a representation of language only, and there's always an unspoken or spoken mirror in there. It is a mere representation of language. But I've come around to the conclusion that it is a modality of language. However, this comes with a few caveats that I want to mention here. One is that obviously I am using the glottographic definition of writing. So in other words, that writing is something that writes language as opposed to other graphical systems. Skip down to that for a sec. Other graphical codes do exist, and I am in no means trying to denigrate them here, but I think it is useful to look at the node of the ontological tree that gathers together graphical systems that do represent writing. I also do admit that other modalities of writing are primary. They are more instinctive. They do come first. People don't learn to read and write if they haven't learned a spoken or a signed language. The other modalities are primary. And sometimes the edges are fuzzy. That does not mean that we can't categorize things. It just means that sometimes something may rest in the middle somewhere, especially back in the early days of writing, when writing was first getting started. This sign of protocuneiform, say, you can ask, is it part of an iconographic system or is it part of writing? We can argue about that. And there have been a number of writing systems that have crossed the boundary where we have drawn the boundaries, things like Aztec hieroglyphs, which were thought not to be writing for a long time, we now realize really were. Another thing I want to make very, very clear is that while writing can only be done by humans, being human does not in any way entail writing. I'm not in any way denigrating the humanity of anybody who does not read and write. Not trying to say that at all, but I am saying that only humans can write. So how is writing a modality of language? Well, for one thing, we use it to express language all the time. More and more as we text people with our little pocket computers. It also serves as linguistic input. Depending on the writing system you know, you may very well read and write words that you don't know, or you don't know how to pronounce. You might learn a whole language you can't speak. I can read a language that I can't speak. So this strengthens the argument that writing is, in fact, a modality of language if you can use it in the absence of a primary modality. And specifically, I claim that writing becomes true language historically in a culture or in the lifetime of a person, that it may not cognitively occupy the space of writing of language when it's first learned, but over time it becomes true language. And this creates what I've called the native script effect. We all have a native language, or sometimes two, if you're lucky. But those native languages make other languages seem a bit weird. They're hard to learn. You're going to have an accent. They just are less natural to you. And so what I claim is that you also have, if you're a literate, especially highly literate person, you also have a native script. Or again, maybe if you're lucky, two. And so other scripts will seem a bit odd, will be hard to learn. You'll have an accent when you write it. And so we have a certain little event here that I'm going to illustrate, which is that people who speak unwritten languages at home, they may have an L1 at home. And then if they go to school, if they speak a minority language, they will probably learn another language in school. So that will be their L2. But that language, if they're learning it in school, is going to be written. So that language has a script. And that is going to be their S1. So a person's script may be associated with a language that is not their native language. And so if then they go to write, maybe even just informally, their home language, they will have the S1, which belongs to L2, to use. And that's what's going to seem natural. And so another script would be S2 and is therefore less likely to seem like a natural and easy fit. Now, sometimes there are things that override this, where if L2 is the language that they don't want to be associated with for some reason, with effort, one can overcome this. But it tends then to make the script of L2 spread. So the effect is that widespread scripts spread yet more widely. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, in other words. And so powerful L2s, languages like Russian or English, that will have scripts that are even more powerful than they are. So the Cyrillic script and the Roman alphabet spread way beyond the languages for which they're originally used. Not that English originally used the Roman alphabet, but you get what I mean. And so here's our first blue point. Be devalued or perceived as too hard, because they're no longer seen by the population that's learned a majority script as S1 as native. So the second thing I've learned about writing, and this stood out to me over and over when I was writing my book, which Yannis so kindly mentioned, The Writing Revolution. And that is that writing fossilizes language. A nice and obvious example of this is cuneiform tablets, where the language, the linguistic message there is literally fossilized on a sedimentary rock. This cuneiform tablet dates from the 7th century BCE, and it records observations of the planet Venus, which were observed 1,000 years before. So the presence of this tablet implies the presence of at least one earlier tablet. On the other end of the temporal scale, you may have something in your pocket, a grocery list, a receipt. These contain fossilized linguistic messages. But it isn't just the linguistic message that gets fossilized. It's the entire language system. One of my favorite examples is Middle Egyptian, because once the Egyptians got their hieroglyphic system well worked out, they kept doing it. And but it wasn't just the signs. It wasn't just the script that was fossilized. It was the entire language. So while the spoken language did its normal thing of changing over time, they used roughly the same language, which we now call Middle Egyptian, for 1,000 years. So writing the hieroglyphic system had the knock-on effect of fossilizing Middle Egyptian. In English, to again come closer to home, we have these fossilized spellings that indicate things that used to be part of our language, words like could and night. And this is in fact how the great cultural super ratchet exists, because it does preserve linguistic messages. Now, once we have fossilization of language, that creates some things which are including classical languages. So when you have to go and learn some very ancient language, how do you think we do this? Except with writing. And it also creates diglossia. So there's a lot of cases, like especially in languages like Arabic or Tamil, where children have to learn an almost completely different language, very, very different dialect at school in order to become literate. Because the written language has become fossilized and the spoken language has changed. And what this creates, here's another blue, creates a high fee, entry fee to literacy. Something those who are studying the acquisition of writing can think about for us. So the third thing I've learned about writing systems is that writing systems analyze language. That is to say, they operate via a linguistic analysis. And so what I mean by that is that they impose categories, they impose units, they segmentation and gaps that are not present in the spoken signal. So for example, you cannot find phonemes in the spoken signal. There is no, you can't chop it. There's the P, and there's the E, and there's the T of the word pet. You can't actually do that on a speech spectrogram. So writing imposes these categories and these gaps in segmentation, but usually on more than one level. We're very used to classifying writing systems as being alphabets or syllabaries or morphographic systems. But in fact, most writing systems work on more than one level. And the kinds of things they point out, the kinds of things I have personally observed in writing systems include sentences, words, morphemes, syllables, moras, segments, and features. So in other words, the whole raft of linguistic units. So I'm going to give 3 examples of how writing imposes an analysis on a linguistic utterance. And all of these could be classified as alphabets. So here's an English sentence, may the force be with you. It is punctuated as a sentence, starts with a capital, ends in a period. So it has been already chunked for us as a sentence. The individual words are demarcated, and more or less the segments. I mean, this is English, so the phoneme to letter ratio correspondence isn't perfect, but more or less we're indicating the phonological segments or morphemes, phonemes. Sorry. Here's an example of Divehi written in Tana. And we also, even though we don't have a capital letter, this is segmented as a sentence. And we also have words. But instead of just phoneme, here's a phoneme, here's a phoneme, here's a phoneme, we get consonants, which are the middle line of the text, and vowels, which are above and below. So instead of just phonemes, we have consonants versus vowels. So a final example in Korean written in Hangul, again, we have a sentence. We have words, although actually, if I wanted to be really technical here, these are not words, they're clitic groups because they include the particle that comes after the word. But now we're also indicating syllables. We're indicating consonants versus vowels. They show up differently. And we're also, and Hangul is famous for this, saying something about the place features of the consonants. So that's very quick for those of you who are not linguists. Don't worry about it too much. The point is that even when we're dealing with supposedly all alphabets, the different levels at which segmentation occurs are different across writing systems. Now, let's compare this to other analyses. This is an analysis of language. That is me saying the word cat about 25 years ago. Here's another one. This is someone saying 19th century. This is a re-encoding of a written message, which is 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. In other words, Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. But the thing about these ones is who knew, right? There were people in the audience who could read the ones I showed on the last slide, but we can't read this, right? So writing imposes an analysis on language that works. As Ray Jackendorf has said, one crucial test of a theory of linguistic structure is whether it can be integrated into a theory of processing. And what I would claim is that writing is by its nature a theory of processing. And as such, writing systems serve as a validation for linguistic theory. So if you have a linguistic unit in your writing system that is consistently and systematically referred to by your writing system, we can conclude that that is a valid linguistic unit. However, as we saw, the units in different writing systems vary. And so they will bias the user, including us, towards certain categories. So if you have a phonemic or segmental writing system, you will be biased towards seeing phonemes. And if you have one that does not include phonemic information, you may not even realize that phonemes exist. As I say, they're not segmentable out of the spoken signal. And in fact, a example that goes the other way here, Chomsky and Halley's famous sound pattern of English, published in 1968, does not contain the word syllable, which now is a little mind-boggling to a phonologist, as I am, that you could think that you could do phonology without having syllables. But they were working with a primarily segmental writing system. I don't think that would have been done if they were primary users of a syllabary. I don't think that's what it would have looked like. Okay, so the fourth thing that I have learned is that writing systems have grammar, and that this is separate from the grammar of the spoken language. Or in other words, writing uses the linguistic toolbox. And there's a number of ways, a number of other people have also been working in this area and doing fascinating work. And I'm just quickly going to use someone else's example here because it's a great example. Classifiers. Classifiers are morphemes that are used in a spoken language to tell you something about the semantic category of the word that it's being used with. Determinatives in written language are signs that are used with another sign to tell you something about the semantic class to which that sign belongs. So we have very similar action here, but they don't occur in the same languages. So for example, Akkadian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs use written determinatives, but the languages for which they used do not use classifiers. But the use of classifiers is available to the human language faculty. So others have looked at syllables, prosodic feet, and here I'm going to just say a little something about morphology in writing systems. So writing, I claim, uses morphology. And there are some instances of written morphology that are analogous to spoken language and some that are analogous to sign language. So the spoken analog, and this is going to be fairly quick, so if it doesn't make a lot of sense to you, ask me later. So in spoken language, we have processes of affixation. We add suffixes and prefixes to things. So if we look at the Akshara-based scripts, and here I'm using Devanagari as an example, we have a situation where the simple Akshara stands for a consonant plus a default vowel, and we can add other vowels to above, below, left, or right of that vowel. And if we have two consonants that we want to put in a row, we can jam them together. So we can have things like ska and kla. So we can see the consonants as morphological stems. And the default case is the uninflected, or the default inflection. And then the affixes are the vowels. But unlike in speech, where you have a unidirectional, your signal is moving in a single direction in time, we have two dimensions here. So we can put these affixes anywhere around the stem that we want to. And when we have the multiple consonants, these are compounds. So, and in this case, the element on the right, no, sorry, the left is reduced, and the one on the right is full. So we have a right-headed compound. That happens in spoken compounding too, that one of the stems will be weak and the other will be strong. So to look at morphology when it's in an analog to sign, I first have to tell you a little bit about sign language morphology, or at least this is American Sign Language, or ASL. ASL has what is known as ion morphs. It doesn't have affixation. What it has instead is families of signs that share overlapping properties. So in this example, words that have to do with classes of groups share certain aspects of the sign. So the movement, the place of articulation, and the orientation in this case are the same. But the hand configuration differs. So you can't separate out the hand configuration and say, oh, that gets added on later. No, it's all together. And so one ion morph is the place of articulation, the movement, the ion orientation, and another ion morph is the hand configuration. And you combine them together and you have a full sign. So the analog to this we find in Canadian Aboriginal syllabics. And I'm going to give you an example from Carrier. But here we're going to see that the shape of the sign is the consonant and the orientation is the vowel. So a V-shaped sign gives us the vowel, the consonant H, and the orientation gives the vowel, and sometimes there's also a dot or a little line added. But you can't take the consonant and vowel are both there, but you can't take them apart. Like we couldn't take apart the ion morphs and say, this is a morpheme that gets added to that one. They combine. So just to sum up what I'm saying about graphic morphology is that it has analogs in speech and sign, but those analogs are independent of the morphology of the primary language. So Carrier, the Carrier language does not use ion morphs. American Sign Language uses ion morphs. And the graphic morphology rather crucially operates in 2 dimensions. So moving on to the 5th thing that I've learned is that some writing systems may be easier to learn than others. And I approach this with a little bit of caution because I am not a psychologist. But there's a certain little nugget of truth, what I think is truth, that sort of peers out at me from behind things whenever I start looking at new writing systems. And that is that there's an effect of clumping together the consonant and vowel, the core of a syllable. So Tana, for example, writes in CV chunks, and the Maldives, where it is used, has had an impressive literacy rate for a very long time in the absence of economic development and formal schooling. Hangul, similarly, will clump together a CV, sometimes with a coda CV, coda C as well. And Korea also has had impressive rates of literacy, even in the absence of economic prosperity in the north. And Hangul is famous for being easy to learn. Hiragana uses CV signs. And according to Taylor and Taylor, at least, Japanese preschoolers can learn, have already learned hiragana by the time they start their formal schooling. The Cherokee syllabary has CV signs. In its day, when it was more commonly used, it was considered very easy to learn, and the literacy rate was higher among the Cherokees than among their white neighbors. The Carrier syllabics that I just showed you where there are signs composed of C and V, was also considered very easy to use in its heyday. There's also what I've called the Akshara advantage, which is, we saw some Aksharas there for the Devanagari, where not every chunk is CV, but many of them are. And that way of arranging signs has been remarkably stable, even though the various scripts that use Aksharas in South and South Asia have diverged tremendously visually. They've diverged in various typological ways, but they have retained the Akshara system. So don't just take my word for this, though. There's now starting to be experimental evidence, for example, by Abu Ahmad and Sher, that children do indeed learn writing systems more easily if they chunk CV together. And yet, here we go blue again, the Roman alphabet is dominant. So this may be something to keep in mind as we try to champion non-Roman scripts. So to sum up this part, writing expresses language, it fossilizes language, it analyzes language, it uses grammar, and it prefers, or at least we seem to prefer, CV groupings. Now, finally, just at the end here, I want to ask, okay, it's important, and this is how it works. What do we do about it? What do we do as scholars for the world, and what do we do for scholarship? And the theme of this conference is entanglement. So I've produced a very entangled chart. And on the left there, we have some of the fundamental concepts, the theoretical concepts. So we want to understand the multimodal language faculty. Specifically, how does it work when we convert it into 2 dimensions and apply it to writing? We also want to understand the full range of writing over time and space so that we truly understand what data we're working with. Then there's interactions of various cultural and cognitive processes and factors. And then we have the applications. And I hope that everyone here can see themselves somewhere on this chart. And if you can't, let me know and I'll add it in before we get to the proceedings. But I've put applications in blue because that's where we can actually start doing something about some of these facts. And some of them, like script development or script preservation efforts for minority languages, it's obvious why that's blue. So I put that in blue. But there are some others too, like typeface design, a subject near to many of your hearts. But if the typeface design is done in service of a minority script, then it's blue too. I've tried to include a lot of different, a whole range of things here, including some that are not represented here at this conference. For example, facilitation of thought. How does writing help us think or process emotions? I mean, this is also part of the field of writing studies. Or some other things that I don't know much about myself, like calligraphy and graffiti. So again, if you don't see yourself on this chart, let me know. I've also added on the very right there, academic inclusion and teaching. And partly because we have a problem with a few partial shining exceptions like this department here. There is no single university department devoted to the study of writing. And as I've just explained, and I hope you believe me, but writing is the great cultural super ratchet that has made possible the world we live in today. And yet we're barely able to study it. So we should all be advocating for inclusion in the academy. And also teaching I've got there, because we should be teaching our students the value of this as well. So to sum up, writing is a deeply human activity. It is the great cultural super ratchet that has amplified the impact of humans on the Earth system and enabled the great acceleration. It has a complex relationship with primary language. It expresses language, fossilizes language, analyzes language, uses the linguistic toolbox. And as such, it sheds light on the human language faculty and what it can do when it's pushed into other modalities. And just finally, as philographers, we can and should serve humanity in various ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this beautiful butterfly collection. Any questions?
To return to the native script effect that you talked about, which I'll read, but we have you here. So I've worked with a lot of minority script communities where someone has invented a new script and they want to get it into the Unicode standard. And the Unicode standard has this implicit or explicit assumption sometimes that the script is used in everyday communication. It's essentially the S1.
Right.
And what your theory helped me understand is that the cases that do tend to find success, like Adlam, which I know you've written about, it's when the language actually didn't have a way to be written before, like the Fula language no one knew in school how to write it, they would learn French. So if they could have written it in Latin script, maybe Adlam wouldn't have caught it.
Right.
So that makes sense. So I'm wondering what happens to the script inventions where there is already an S1, like could you speculate a bit, or do you know examples of those also finding success in some way, and specifically like in a way that something like the Unicode standard might recognize?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's extremely important is school. So if it can get taught in school, then it's got a chance. Because otherwise, you know, the L2's script is going to be dominant. So that's, yeah.
It's not currently the key criteria. It's in there, but it's not the one that makes the difference.
Yeah, yeah.
Adam?
Thank you for this amazing presentation. I'm really, like most of us, I think, quite moved by it. But before coming to this conference, I read a book by a philosopher, Alva Noy, which is called, it is called Entanglement. So I thought, maybe I can pick up something to say something's useful in my talk. And I thought I found it too overwhelming to translate his ideas here. Not because I didn't like them, but I didn't feel prepared. And what he proposes in this book, as far as I understand it, is that it is, a philosophical book, so he's in the business of explaining or trying to explain what makes humans human, which is a big task. And he says, well, two things. One is writing, the other one is art. However, what he means by writing is a little broader than us as philographers, linguists, mean by writing. And I think, so it is really a plug for his book. But what I find that maybe we should probably revise our way of thinking about writing and think of it as a bit more broadly, which would allow us And it's something that I get from social semioticians like Gunter Kress, who told me a long time ago that he stopped using the word language because it's too abstract. So he would talk about speech and writing as two modalities. And I think this is important because when we talk about writing as in contrast to language, we are using concepts from different domains, modality, and some kind of abstract designation of I don't know what, what is language really? It's a bit too diffuse. It's what Chomsky would think that he knows about. But I think we are, and this would allow us not to use formulations such as language without writing or script. Because according to Alva Noy, I think if you could make a sort of meta-linguistic comments about communication, for example, by producing a piece of poetry, oral poetry, or making a mark on the ground, you have writing. So he's looking at writing as a second order system of signification rather than something that we need to learn formally. It's a bit like if you have movement, you can dance. Okay, anyone can dance. If you dance at the wedding of your daughter, it's not necessarily art, but it is second order of signification of movement. And I think maybe we should sort of adopt this kind of view of writing, at least for some purposes. I'm not saying that a lot of analysis, I think it's just that for me, you're opening up this discussion at a slightly more general level. That's kind of makes me think about his work as well.
Well, for me, if you had said symbol use, what characterizes humans is symbol use, I think I would be more on board with that view. The thing is, there are various we can construct a tree. Here are the codes that write languages. Here's other forms of symbol use, and it varies which one we attach the label writing to. But that doesn't mean that the other nodes in the tree are unimportant or uninteresting. I have found that looking at the node where the symbols are used in the service of language, I have found it a very productive node to be concentrating on. And but I also realize that there are other, we could see what I'm calling writing as simply part of a larger phenomenon. That's absolutely true.
Thank you so much.
Helen.
Not that. Piers Kelly recently mentioned in seminars symbolic culture, and he sort of places within symbolic culture things that we're interested in, but also things like dance, kind of music, song, for example. So then it's a very broad. Well, I personally find it very helpful when thinking about how my writing system operates. And I was wondering what you thought about symbolic culture as a sort of over-categorically sometimes.
Yes, that's very interesting, and I'm thinking that in terms of the slides I showed at the beginning, what are some of the answers to what makes us human? Maybe we're missing one, that symbolic culture would be one as well. Very good point.
A question about, okay, writing as a modality of language, which I really like this idea, but I'm curious about kind of submodalities of writing itself, because I was thinking in particular, I tried on a few occasions to use typewriters to distraction-free write, and it doesn't work, maybe not for the reasons you might imagine. I find it very, as someone who grew up with computers, I find it very difficult to not be able to randomly edit. Like you can't move to any particular point in the text and insert text there and copy and paste. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I'm just very curious about that kind of those kind of submodalities of writing and like maybe cognitive aspects of that. If you have any thoughts?
Yes, but not necessarily on typing versus word processing. But I do think that the modality with which we write is important.
Mhm.
There's work that's come out showing that handwriting, if you handwrite something, you're more likely to remember it.
Mhm.
And I like to use the word embodied cognition at times like this, because what we do with our body, even just if you're holding it, I find that I can read. I feel more connected to a text that I'm reading if I can hold it,
Mhm.
as opposed to just looking at it.
Yeah.
But I realize that's not exactly an answer to your question.
That's great. I was just using an example.
Yeah.
All modality, handwriting, computers,
Yeah.
anything. Very.
Well, and one of the big changes that has happened is that for the common person, writing has changed from an act of creation to an act of selection. And it used to be only type compositors that did it by selection. And now we all do it by selection rather than by creation. And it's interesting to think about what effects that has on us cognitively, what effects it has on just the nature of writing, how how much type we now see. I was reviewing a paper the other day, and it said something about children learning to read. The task was to interpret print. I was like, no, the task is to learn to read text, not necessarily print. But they were using the term print to mean any written text, as though handwriting no longer exists. But I think it's worth thinking about how the different modalities of writing do affect us cognitively.
Thank you.
That's here. She.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. Like, it's really interesting question, I think, that you raised, and it's really important to address them. So we talked a lot about language, and I noticed that was used sometimes as well to mean like spoken language. So what do you mean by language? Like what's for you like the definition of language?
That's that's a big question.
Right.
Because it has been used as well to define writing, as a
Right.
modality of language, but
But what is language?
what do you mean by language? I mean, not what
Right.
it is in general, right? What do you mean, like in this case?
Well, I mean, speaking, signing, writing, all of those are language, but I may have sometimes used it as a shorthand to mean the primary modalities of language, speech and sign. But language is a system of using signs that resides in our brains and that we express in speech, writing, or sign.
Also, another thing, because I've been also thinking about those questions, and also read Altano, very interesting. And what he says is like that writing is like a way of organizing, like we naturally tend to organize things as we are organisms. So writing in a way is like a natural way we interact with the words, organizing this like the symbolic system. But it happened something to me that I was looking at stars, like we usually don't really see the stars. On the fact that writing is like a human modality, but aren't the star a writing system also? So cannot not just human, but the environment we live in generate writing, because it's something that in the past and for many like also writing system, beginning of writing system, they've been relying lots on stars. And calendar, everything that we use now also as a measurement of time, we're using writing more, comes from the stars and cycles of Earth. So isn't that also writing?
That's an interesting question. I would say no, but that doesn't mean that there aren't analogies that can be drawn, that there aren't commonalities. To me, writing has a human agent. But we talk about reading, reading the stars or reading other things. To me, that I see that as a metaphorical usage or a usage by analogy. Partly, as I say, because when I look at writing as this kind of thing that humans do, I see I can then start drawing generalizations. It's a useful, again, the node of the ontological tree for me to what I'm studying. But that doesn't mean that these other things aren't, again, like the caveat is that these other codes exist and they are important and they are beautiful and they're worth studying. Absolutely. But just because something is analogous in many ways, I wouldn't say it necessarily makes it the same phenomenon.
Okay, thank you. If you think of the task of writing as inscription, and obviously handwriting, chiseling the letters on a steel is an immediate inscription, would you think that print or the writing component of a typographic product, a newspaper, etc., would you accept the idea of a mediated inscription? So when we type using Word or using LibreOffice, it's a mediated experience, a mediated task. We get writing, but not by an immediate inscription. Would you accept that the idea of mediated inscription?
Yes, and that is in fact what we all have nowadays. It's if we press the A key here, it's easy to think that it's somehow connected in there, like with the typewriter, to an A, and it's not. There's a lot of technology between my pressing that A and anything coming out either on the screen or on a piece of paper or anywhere. So yes, and we're living in a period of more and more mediated writing. Yes.
Right. Writing is mediated. Whether a pen is a technology, it's in principle it's not different from computer.
Absolutely. Which is why in my definition, I said a technologically mediated modality. Yes. All forms of writing are, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but speech and sign,
No, but it's material mediation, we use the error waves, yeah? It's, everything is materially mediated.
that's true, yes.
Then we have a question from the online audience. Arvind, if you can hear us, can you either unmute so we can hear your question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I was, in fact, trying to type out my question. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Great talk on so many fronts. I wanted to ask you about the native script effect in particular, because it does seem to be a nice compact explanation for what is, very often in linguistic literature been described as a script choice, especially, by communities, especially those, professing a particular religion. So, the fact that a particular community has written their vernacular, their native language in a particular script, which is identified with the religion, that's been characterized as script choice. But it does seem that, for example, Yiddish or, Urdu and Hindi, rather than being a sort of active choice based on one's religion or confession, it could be quite neatly explained in terms of the native script effect. In other words, especially in historical contexts, if you were literate in your community, in your liturgical script, you would then, that would become your S1, and then it would only be logical that you would apply your S1 to write your L1. I was
Absolutely.
wondering, to what extent do you think that applies, and how that, say, interacts with the idea that communities actively choose their script?
I think you're absolutely right that this definitely works in the liturgical area. And yes, I suspect therefore that the choice is often then sort of made for them. But there are certainly communities that actively choose something different because they want to visual uniqueness. But the sort of the momentum goes toward just using the what has become the S1. But as you say, it's not just schooling, it's liturgical use. Even it can occur when they, say teachers and bureaucrats and all the kinds of other people, they're not going to say, oh, this minority community should have its own script. They should do it the way we all do it.
Okay, I think we should stop. We have time for one last question.
One
My
last.
privilege as a chair to
Oh.
ask. Your book goes from cuneiform to the internet. So my question is, what comes next? So in a transhumanist perspective, when iPhones will be inside our brains, we will still be using writing or speech or nothing of all
That is a good question. The death of writing and the death of books has been forecast many times, and it hasn't happened yet. If you look at phones, right, they're telephones. They're supposed to be for talking on, but we text on them. So I think that text is going to stay with us. And when we get the implant, we'll learn how to text with it.
So we will text to our organs to walk.
Well, no, maybe not to our own organs, but for communicating to other people. You know, I sometimes watch a YouTube video with the sound off. And so I can just read the subtitles. So, and also there are times when I will go and there's the wiki how-to on something, and or I could look it up on YouTube, and I'll do the wiki how-to because it's faster. Reading is faster. And unless we solve that problem, then the written word will remain with us.
Okay, thank you very much, Amalia.